Good morning and welcome back to Herd Immunity, where wisdom is your best defense. Today I would like to talk to you about a study that was performed at the Hospital for Special Surgery in New York City. It was a retrospective review of patients who had been admitted to the hospital for elective orthopedic surgery over a period of about a month between March 2020 and April 2020. The point of the study was to evaluate the number of patients who were positive for COVID. As you may recall, New York City was experiencing a deluge of COVID cases in March of 2020. The governor was on TV every day. They were opening up the Javits Center. It was a problem. The Hospital for Special Surgery is quite a reputable institution, and they wanted to both keep the operating rooms going, of course, but they wanted to do it safely, both for the staff and for the patients. So they began to screen everyone. Never mind, you're not sick, you're sick. They began to screen everyone, testing them for evidence of COVID, SARS CoV-2. And what did they find? They found that a little over 12% of the patients that they tested, and they tested all of them, were positive for COVID. Obviously, no one showed up at the hospital to have a hip replaced who was clearly sick. So these were patients who were screened both in terms of their symptoms, but everyone was tested for COVID. They found that a little over 12% of the patients were positive for SARS CoV-2. And then they found that 60% of them were completely asymptomatic. 60%. At the height of what were the darkest days for New York City with regard to the COVID pandemic last year. I bring this up now because the world is now facing the prospect of another wave of COVID, the Delta variant, and certainly Israel is dealing with it and the UK is dealing with it, and it looks like we're going to be dealing with it if we're not dealing with it already. It happens to be in every state in the country right now. And so, whereas I think it's fair to say at this point that all of us, 7.2 plus billion people on Earth, have become the flesh pots for SARS CoV-2. There are people who have recovered from COVID and by all calculations should be immune to the Delta variant. Much less than 1%, we think, of patients who have recovered from COVID will be reinfected and become ill with Delta COVID. Furthermore, there are a large percentage. Last year in New York City, it was, 6% of people walking in the door at the Hospital for Special Surgery who were asymptomatic and who were obviously positive for COVID and immune. And if they were positive for COVID and immune last year, they should be immune this year. The question is, how many more people, now that COVID has swept the face of the earth, how many people have become infected with COVID, remained asymptomatic, and are immune, and thus will be exempt from the hazards of the Delta COVID surge that the world is now experiencing? I will post some links to scientific papers that would help suggest what the percentages are. At least 12% last year, based on this one study. I have seen citations where scientific authors are proposing that as much as 30% of the population have immunity. This can be somewhat reassuring. Now, we know that if you've been vaccinated, you are not immune. The statistics may suggest that half, 65%, pick your favorite large number of people who were vaccinated may be immune to the Delta variant, but you are not a statistic. You are a person, and if you've been vaccinated, you are at risk for developing COVID, Delta. Make no mistake, do not delude yourself. Do not let anyone else delude you. You're not interested in what happens to 1,000 people. You want to know what's going to happen to me. So pay attention to any symptoms that you might have. If you're coming down with a cold and you think it's a summer cold, you might want to call your doctor right away. Now, something else to keep in mind as I close out my morning rounds here, again, is from today's liturgy. So welcome to church here. We're going to talk about Exodus again. So here we are now studying what's happening to Moses and the Israelites. Moses says, we're going to get out of here. We are going to free ourselves of the bondage of Pharaoh and the Egyptians. Pack up. We're heading out tonight. So the Israelites bolt out of Egypt. Pharaoh goes running after them. They come to the Red Sea. Oh my goodness, God parts the Red Sea. The Israelites, the Israelites bolt across the dry land, the basically seabed. They get to the other side. Pharaoh's charioteers and chariots and the army, whatever, they're all hot on the tail of Moses and the Israelites, and they're swallowed up as the sea then reconvenes. So the Israelites, great, they made it out of Egypt, and they were able to get past the Red Sea, and Pharaoh's army's been destroyed. Beautiful. Now the Israelites are in the desert, and they're complaining, and they're saying to Moses and his son Aaron, thanks very much for getting us out of bondage, but we're starving. This is the desert, and we are starving. We got, orders to bolt right away. We didn't have time to pack up, this, that, and the other, and now we have nothing, and we're starving. And we think, as a matter of fact, that we would have been better off back in Egypt in bondage to Pharaoh. At least we had our flesh pots and food. What are we going to do now? So Moses and Aaron think, okay, how are we going to get this crowd under control? And God sends manna. You remember the story of manna. Well, when I was growing up, the story of manna was, in my imagination, and this was true today at church, the imagined vision is that God is dropping loaves of Wonder Bread and focaccia and challah and baguettes, maybe Ritz crackers. They're all coming down from heaven. That's not what the Scripture says. What the Scripture says is that in the morning, the Israelites woke up. They're still all, grumbling and upset. And what do they find? They find what I believe is grain that has been blown from the east. This is what the Scripture says, from the east and from the south, at their feet, like hoarfrost. So they're dusted. The ground at their feet is dusted. Now, of course, the men are still complaining, and the women get busy, right? That's what the women do. And they gather this up, and they use it to make bread. The point of the story, as I see it, is what you need is at your feet. It's what you need for the day. It's at your feet. Gather it up and do something with it. If you are sick, get in touch with the doctors, because they can now treat and even prevent COVID. If you have long COVID, if you've had COVID and you haven't completely recovered, you've been suffering with symptoms for more than 3 months, maybe you've been suffering with symptoms for over a year, there are treatments for that. They are well beyond 90% effective, so you don't have to sit home and suffer unnecessarily. And until I see you again, remember that the two best medicines are love and mercy. God bless.